The 11 years that had elapsed since the 1956 year were the most tranquil, the most peaceful, the most fertile and progressive years in our history. Our economy flourished, immigration had increased, our international position was broadening year by year. As foreign minister, I presided over 91 Israeli embassies in all the 5 continents of the world. We wanted nothing except the continuation of that movement of consolidation.
But Syrian air raids in the north in April 1967 reminded us that tranquility had not been achieved. Syrian shelling of our border kibbutzim from the Golan Heights told the same story. In May, these tensions increased as the Soviet Union fed false reports to President Nasser of Egypt of an imminent Israeli attack on Syria. Nasser responded by ordering his troops to move into Sinai after he had demanded the removal of United Nations forces. Soon after came his most dramatic move. Nasser declared a naval blockade of the Straits of Tiran, cutting off our approaches to East Africa and Asia, and denying our access to Persian Gulf oil.
Israel's port city of Eilat, one of the Middle East hottest spots, following a blockade of the Gulf of Aqaba by the United Arab Republic. 10 years ago, Israel went to war over the same blockade.
Egypt had placed Israel in a stranglehold. The wheels of war had been set in motion as Nasser announced to the world, "The Straits of Tiran are part of our territorial waters. No Israeli ship will ever navigate it again."
Therefore, one link after another creates the chain. Soviet incitement, Syrian hypochondria, and Egypt almost reluctantly drawn into the fray. But having been drawn in, they become intoxicated by their success, by the lack of international resistance, by rumors that Israel, no longer under Ben-Gurion, but under Levi Eshkol, is very unlikely to respond either to the blockade or to troop concentrations. That is the story of the Six-Day War, the most unwanted war in Israel's history.
The blockade was a blatant act of war. If Nasser got away with this, he could commit aggression against us at will. Now, threats about total annihilation were being broadcast daily from Arab capitals. Israel prepared for the very worst. In Tel Aviv, air raid shelters were opened. Hospitals organized for mass casualties. Kibbutzim fortified. Friends and relatives abroad offered to take our children. There was fear in the land and dread of a new Holocaust. When I asked our chief of staff what we diplomats could do, he said nervously, "Oh, time. Give us time to move our forces south and prepare for war." How to react? That was the central issue, which we so passionately debated in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, following Nasser's actions and the Arab threats. It was vital for us in the Israeli government, and especially for me as foreign minister, to explore every alternative avenue before committing the nation to war. Our government now asked me to go to Washington to rally the support of President Johnson and meet with other Western leaders. The meeting with de Gaulle was crucial. France was our principal supplier of weapons and aircraft and had been our firm ally since the 50s. De Gaulle's words before I even sat down were, "Oh, ne faites pas la guerre," do not make war. He didn't see the blockade as an act of war. He gave me fully to understand that he feared and believed that an Egyptian-Israeli war would not be isolated or contained, but that it would expand into some cataclysmic global disaster. And so I looked at him again, our greatest friend, who had sustained us for the whole of the past decade, and I understood that de Gaulle had abandoned us. In London, I met Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who was far more sympathetic.
It is the view of Her Majesty's government in the United Kingdom that the Straits of Tiran must be regarded as an international waterway through which the vessels of all nations have a right of passage.
Can you tell us what you discussed with the Prime Minister?
Well, I think everybody knows what the main subject that preoccupies both the British government and the Israeli government today is. It's the situation created by what we say is the illegal decision to blockade the Straits of Tiran and the Gulf of Aqaba.
The government of the United States is deeply concerned, in particular with three...
President Johnson was committed to keeping the Straits of Tiran open, but I knew that the Vietnam War had weakened his authority. He said to me, "You are the victims of aggression, and I would like to break the blockade with an international force. Israel will not be alone unless it decides to be alone." As I flew home, my impressions were clear. It was doubtful if we would get naval help, but President Johnson would not stand in the way of any actions that we might take alone. This I reported immediately on my return. Never in my life have I been in a room so charged with expectancy and tension as when we discussed the issues. With us was our Chief of Staff, General Yitzhak Rabin, a veteran commander from the War of Independence and the Sinai Campaign of 1956.
We, the military people, proposed and demanded that a green light will be given to go to the attack.
Our forces had been mobilized since the last week of May in response to Nasser's threats. But this complete mobilization, without any purpose on the horizon, was something that we had never undergone before. In psychological and emotional terms, it was almost unbearable for our nation to endure. Levi Eshkol's power of decision was much greater than his power of expression. He was the least charismatic of Israel's prime ministers, the most folksy, the most easygoing. But unexpectedly, he became the most successful of them and died with all his gains in peace and war intact. In the face of Israel's most serious crisis since independence, an emergency national unity government was formed, which brought Menachem Begin, the leader of the opposition, into the cabinet. To alleviate further anxiety, Moshe Dayan, the hero of Sinai, was appointed Minister of Defense. This made little difference to strategy, as battle plans had already been fixed. But the effect on the national morale was enormous. In Egypt and Syria, preparations were reaching a climax. Iraq and Saudi Arabia now pledged forces to the battle. Now Nasser declared to the Egyptian parliament, "Our goal is to destroy Israel."
He was preparing for it, but when to start it, we didn't know. And whether he was fully ready for that or not, we didn't know. But the whole people were excited, and they were expecting something from Nasser and his army.
King Hussein of Jordan signed a mutual defense pact with Nasser, placing his forces under Egyptian command. Now, as the Arab world united for the battle with Israel, King Hussein found himself drawn to its center. Arabs everywhere were encouraged to join the jihad, the holy war against Israel, and to avenge 1948. Wide media coverage of the Arab build-up created anguished suspense and solidarity for Israel around the world. The idea of an attack on us and the extinction of Israel was terrifying.
Large crowds saying we want to destroy Israel, the natural reaction for Israelis is to say, if that's going to happen, well, let's do something first. Rhetoric, whether it's moderate or extreme, does have either an appeasing effect or an inflammatory effect in action and not only in words.
Demonstrations of solidarity with Israel took place throughout the free world. It seemed that Israel's life was clearly at stake. War was almost a certainty. The only question was when. And if war started, who could guess where it would end?
If Nasser, Colonel Nasser, were to succeed against Israel, his next move would be against his brother Arabs. Make no mistake about that.
The cabinet met on June the 4th. We sat for 7 long hours. The days of anguish, suspense, deliberation were over. Prime Minister Eshkol called for the vote. Each of us knew exactly what he was doing and what was to be decided. Life or death, for soldiers, for citizens, who knows, perhaps for the nation itself, all this was in the balance. All hands were raised. There was no choice. Yes, we were going to war. In the early dawn of Monday, June the 5th, Israeli jets sped towards Egyptian targets. General Mordechai Hod was the commander of our Air Force. His objective was clear.
To plan the operation as such that we will hit first the most dangerous element of the Egyptian Air Force, meaning the bombers and the fighters that had enough range to reach civilian centers of Israel.
In less than 3 hours, 300 Egyptian combat fighters had been destroyed. On the same morning, a three-pronged armored attack was launched in Sinai. Our forces moved swiftly, destroying the fiercest opposition. We knew that immediate danger had been averted, but could only imagine the price that was being paid in life and blood for our safety. By the end of the second day of the war, Israeli armor had occupied the Gaza Strip, had smashed major Egyptian defense positions, and commanded all Sinai routes leading to the west and south. Nevertheless, the Egyptians began broadcasting news reports announcing immense Egyptian gains and huge Israeli losses from the first hours of June the 5th.
When the 1967 war started, I was in the University of Cairo. In the morning, I opened the radio. There were military marches being broadcasted, and the broadcaster was announcing communiques one after the other. Declaring that 50, 100, 150 Israeli planes were shot down when Israel attacked Egypt. It took us more than 3 days before we realized that the war ended up with the victory of Israel.
In the very first hours after the outbreak of hostilities with Egypt, our most urgent aim was to avoid Jordan's involvement. So I drafted a letter for Prime Minister Eshkol and asked the United Nations Chief of Staff to take it urgently, immediately to Amman, calling upon Hussein to avoid becoming involved. Certain of Arab success, Jordan tragically and with disastrous consequences opened fire along the entire front and in western Jerusalem. The Jordanians caused a tremendous number of our casualties, but by Wednesday, June the 7th, Israeli forces had captured most of the West Bank. The main battle now moved to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a divided city. The front ran through its center, separating Jerusalem into east, held by Jordan, and west, held by Israel. East Jerusalem was captured in one of the most savage battles of the war, involving tanks, infantry, and hand-to-hand combat.
I was working as a doctor in the Augusta Victoria Hospital in Jerusalem. Actually, people thought, when they saw the Israeli tanks, thought they were Iraqi tanks. And some of them went out to receive them, and, you know, very happy about it. But then, of course, they found out they were not Iraqis. Now, it was a very severe shock for all of us.
Finally, the old city was encircled. The last defending Jordanian troops trapped inside. The military were waiting for our instructions. We held a cabinet meeting in the air raid shelter of the Knesset. We weighed the capture of the old city. To protect the holy places, it would have to be taken street by street, and the battle would be costly. The order was given to commence the attack.
We were the first unit that broke into the East Jerusalem. It was a very strange feeling. It was a mixture of euphoria and a deep pain because of the losses. It was the first time that we suffered so many casualties.
Would our victory be cancelled by United Nations pressure? All eyes were focused on the Security Council.
I've just come from Jerusalem to tell the Security Council that Israel, by her independent effort and sacrifice, has passed from serious danger to successful resistance. The friendly governments expressed the rather ominous hope that Israel would manage to live. But the dominant theme of our condition was danger and solitude. Now, there could be no doubt about what was intended for us. With my very ears, I heard President Nasser's speech on May the 26th. He said, "We intend to open a general assault against Israel. This will be total war."
No decision had yet been taken about action against Syria. While Prime Minister Eshkol visited the area, I received a call from a high US official. He hinted that it would be illogical if the war were to end with the Syrians suffering no penalty for having provoked it. This point was also vigorously argued by the kibbutz farmers who had been subjected to Syrian shelling for years. With General Elazar in command of the Northern Front, it was decided in a cabinet meeting in Tel Aviv to go ahead to storm the Golan Heights and to silence the guns that had been pounding us since the beginning of the hostilities. The attack began on Friday, June the 9th. It was an almost impossible mission. The stark hills of the Golan Heights were fortified 10 miles deep and defended by deadly artillery, armor, and minefields. The Syrians had dug themselves in on a massive scale. Nevertheless, Israeli armored bulldozers and tanks began the ascent with the men following. The frontal attack was successful, but the proximity of the forces, the aerial bombardments, and the frequent hand-to-hand fighting made this one of the bloodiest encounters of the war. On Saturday, the troops pushed on, wiping out the last pockets of resistance. By late afternoon, the entire Golan Heights were in Israeli hands. While the fate of the Golan was being debated, our troops in Sinai had continued their advance, destroying Egyptian armor and installations and taking thousands of prisoners. By June the 8th, all Sinai was in Israeli hands and the blockade of Eilat was ended. The final target, the Suez Canal, had been captured, placing Israel astride one of the great waterways of international commerce. By the evening of June the 10th,
a general ceasefire had been agreed by all the parties, the land fell quiet. We had lived 6 unforgettable days. We were now free to survey our losses and our gains. The losses: 750 Israeli soldiers killed, 2,000 wounded. Israel now controlled territories 4 times its previous size. And the unbelievable had happened. After 19 years of absence, and after great pain and loss, Israel had returned to the heart of Jerusalem. In Israel, after the Six-Day War, a mass euphoria engulfed the nation. All of us began to take in the newly enlarged land of Israel. Israelis rediscovered sites intimately connected to the history of the Bible. The most dramatic achievement of the Six-Day War was the return to Old Jerusalem and to the western wall of the Temple Mount, the symbolic center of the Jewish faith, which had been barred to us for 19 years. All of us, Arab and Jew, had memories of the other side from before 1948. The barriers had come down, and the hope was that there would at last be peace within the walls of Jerusalem. The man who was to oversee the unification of the city was Teddy Kollek, the recently elected mayor.
We had always hoped for a unification of the city. We had hoped it would come about peacefully and not through war. It came suddenly, and I was very much aware of the difficulties of uniting the city again, a city in which you had Jews from 103 countries, 40 different denominations of Christians, and about 25% Muslims who wanted to remain Muslims and didn't choose this unification.
Jerusalem became a focus of national and international attention. The old city was improved and beautified. The Jewish quarter was reconstructed, and Jewish families returned to live in the old city. While the old city was being revived, new neighborhoods sprang up, encircling East and West Jerusalem. Jerusalem has always been a city and a symbol revered by most of the civilized world, so it was not altogether surprising that at the first opportunity, many visitors came to Israel to see the holy places from which war and danger had so long excluded them. And in view of the spiritual and moral ideas which were conceived in Jerusalem, it was the city's past which most captured the heart and minds of all who visited it. As the new reality sunk in, its reverberations were felt outside Israel.
2,000 volunteers from Britain, 850 from France, 800 from South Africa.
Thousands of young people arrived to work in Israel as volunteers in kibbutzim and development towns. Many made the decision to immigrate.
When I came to Israel, I was part of a group of many young volunteers that we all came over from New York. We joined many volunteers that were here, and people were coming from all over the world. Young people who had left their studies, all feeling that they had to be here, they had to be part of this country to help in whatever way we were asked to help.
The war had been won. The diplomatic battle was just beginning. In the General Assembly, the Soviet Union condemned us, demanding our immediate, total, unconditional withdrawal from all the occupied territories. My answer was simple.
I shall invite every peace-loving state represented here to ask itself how it would have acted on that day if it faced similar dangers. It is beyond all honest doubt. It is beyond all honest doubt that between the 14th of May and June the 5th, Arab governments, led and directed by President Nasser, methodically prepared and mounted an aggressive assault designed to bring about Israel's immediate and total destruction.
The Security Council, expressing its continuing concern with the grave situation in the Middle East.
In the Security Council, the British delegate, Lord Caradon, cooperating closely with the Americans, began drafting a resolution for a UN peace formula. Resolution 242, which was unanimously adopted here, was a deliberately ambiguous document. On the one hand, it called, as expected, for
withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict.
Not all the territories, and not the territories occupied in the recent conflict, which is, of course, what our adversaries would have wanted. On the other hand, it firmly asserted
their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force.
In the end, most Israelis understood that this was a positive document. It did, after all, fulfill our central goal, which was to ensure our legitimate right to retain our presence in the territories in order to negotiate a peace settlement from strength. While Israelis felt a new stability and a new hope, our adversaries were contemplating the bitter fruits of their leaders' wild rhetoric.
And finally they said, we lost the war, the Israelis are coming, everyone should raise the white flag. I saw everybody calling for prominent figures to go nearby the municipality in order to welcome the conquerors so that to avoid a massacre or a tragedy which might happen if they come without anybody receiving them. I tried to convince myself that I should go at least for curiosity, but finally I was so humiliated, even a kid, and I decided not to go. I decided not to see them and not to be in that moment.
For the Arabs, the price of the war was immense. Arab losses were estimated at 30,000 killed or wounded, and 1 million Palestinians were under our rule. Now, their leaders defeated, thousands of Arabs were to flee their homes, apprehensive of what the future would bring. The Soviet and Arab proposals for our total and unconditional withdrawal from all the territories without peace were heavily defeated in the General Assembly of the United Nations. Now, this was a spectacular victory. It meant for me that the patient work of preparation, diplomatic preparation, before the war had paid off. Earlier, the Eshkol government had empowered me to make important peace proposals to Arab states. Peace treaties with Egypt and Syria on the basis of the international boundaries. This would have meant our withdrawal from all of Sinai and from the Golan Heights. The Arab states rejected those proposals as well. That's what I meant when I once said that they had never lost a chance of missing an opportunity. Later, I secretly met King Hussein of Jordan in London several times to see how he would react to a proposal for the return of most, although not all, of the territory of the West Bank.
Not in a position at this stage to specifically define the Arab stand.
Well, he said, I can't do it I doubt if I can be the first and only Arab state to make peace, and if I do, I must have every single inch of the territory. In September 1967, 13 Arab heads of state met in Khartoum. They concluded their summit with a declaration of 3 no's: no recognition of Israel, no negotiations, and no peace.
After that, we started to think of how to get rid of the occupation politically, and with contacting our people outside and the United Nations here and there, and we were expecting the whole world will stand with us and let the Israelis go back to their old frontiers.
For the Palestinians, the situation was very strange. They were still Jordanian citizens, but now they found themselves living and working under Israeli rule.
After the war, the period of depression went on for some time. Some of our elder men thought that flash of victory on the Israeli side can't last long. And this came to be true. The happiness about victory decreased and the depression started to fade away. And my feeling is that the situation did improve. And maybe that is the hope for the future.
It was economic prosperity in Israel following the Six-Day War, which went some way toward quelling the discontent, the anger and frustration at the occupation, which was felt in the West Bank and in Gaza. The need for workers in factories, farming and construction was immense. Thousands of West Bankers and Gazans came every day to work in Israel, and Israel became dependent on their labor. The new economic reality very quickly became taken for granted.
When I finished my studies in June 1968, my father decided that it's better for me to apply for a permit to visit Israel. When I got home, I was expecting that my family would be in hard economic conditions and that they will be resisting the occupation. My shock was when they started serving me Israeli beer, Israeli merchandise, Israeli cigarettes. For me, that was, unacceptable.
In the absence of any serious peace talks, Israeli rule over the territories tightened. There was a growing public opinion in favor of permanently retaining the Golan Heights. Sinai seemed to be a buffer, protecting our population centers. Israelis felt safe behind those borders. The reality was different. Later, over 750 Israeli soldiers would die fighting in Sinai. Settlements were also built for security, but would civilian settlers really stop tanks? I was one of many Israelis who asked these disturbing questions. The new territories enlarged our space, but they also involved us in ruling a rebellious people. I saw them as assets that could one day be exchanged for peace, but which must not be relinquished so long as peace was denied. Besides the establishment of new settlements, there were other regions in the captured territories where Israelis remembered living before 1948, which were soon resettled. Hebron was one. In 1929, it had been the site of a massacre when scores of Jews were killed and injured. In 1967, Israelis began traveling to Hebron to pray at the tomb of the patriarchs, a site holy to both Muslims and Jews. Soon after, Kiryat Arba, a settlement right next to Hebron, was established on the initiative of militant religious Jews. The settlers and the government were creating facts, settlements and military installations in parts of the territories. The Israelis were not alone in creating facts in the Middle East. The Soviet Union rapidly rearmed Syria and Egypt to above pre-1967 levels. Now Nasser could prepare for a new war. The front line was to be the Suez Canal, which had been blocked since 1967. In October 1968, Egyptian shelling killed 15 Israeli soldiers in a single afternoon. The war of attrition had begun. The Egyptians believed that with continual bombardment, they would gradually force the Israelis to withdraw. To provide a frontline defense against Egyptian artillery, the new Israeli chief of staff, General Chaim Bar-Lev, constructed a series of reinforced concrete and steel bunkers along the whole length of the canal. 30 of these fortresses were built at a cost of millions of dollars. Together, they made up the Bar-Lev line. February 1969, as the war of attrition gained momentum, the nation was saddened by the death of Prime Minister Levi Eshkol. He had led the country to its greatest triumph, and his passing was deeply felt. His successor was Golda Meir, destined to lead Israel through the most difficult years since independence. By the summer of 1969, our casualties along the canal were seriously mounting. Israel needed a new tactic. It happened in the air. For 3 months, Israeli jets flew mission after mission against Egyptian frontline positions, inflicting immense damage. Since the Six-Day War, Israel had suffered 3,000 casualties, dead and wounded, along the canal. Egyptian casualties were estimated at 10,000. Everything seemed to be escalating into a head-on confrontation with both Egypt and its ally, the Soviet Union. Now I met constantly with President Nixon and Secretary of State Rogers, trying to defuse the tension. What was proposed was a 90-day ceasefire during which Israel and Egypt would negotiate under the mediation of UN envoy Gunnar Yaring. But when the Egyptians moved missiles into forward sites, this nearly torpedoed everything. The talks went on. Yet though the missiles stayed in place, for the moment, Sinai was calm. In September 1970, Gamal Abdel Nasser died. For almost 2 decades, he had stood at the center of the Arab world, and his passing was deeply mourned.
I met Nasser in Cairo, and he was a giant, I think. I mean, when he died, the women were tearing their hair and crying.
His successor was an unknown entity, Anwar Sadat.
Sadat's aim, as Nasser's aim, was to bring back the territories lost to Egypt. He already communicated to the Americans during the funeral of Nasser his intention to seek a graduated steps toward peace. At that time, Mrs. Golda Meir was not responsive, even to her own generals, who were willing to test and probe the intentions of Sadat.
After the Six-Day War, alliances shifted dramatically in the Middle East. The Arab world was rocked by revolutions. In Syria, General Hafez al-Assad rose to power in a bloody military coup. 2 decades of French alliance came to an end when de Gaulle imposed an embargo on French weapons sales. The United States became Israel's principal ally and armorer. For the Arabs in the refugee camps and the villages, the mood was depressed. The Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, which had been founded in 1964, was discredited. The man who emerged to lead the PLO for the coming decades was Yasser Arafat. Arafat's men carried out bomb attacks in Israel. Sudden explosions in busy places became an almost daily occurrence, with a heavy toll in dead and injured civilians. The army clamped down. Scores of guerrillas were killed in firefights. Hundreds were captured. By late 1968, Arafat and his men had fled the West Bank and moved into Jordan. From Jordan, the PLO launched strikes into Israel and became a law unto themselves. Arafat and his men even plotted to remove King Hussein and to set up a Palestinian state. When Arab guerrillas blew up 3 foreign planes on a desert airfield, Jordan seemed to be on the verge of anarchy. In September 1970, King Hussein, protecting his own authority, ordered his troops to attack the PLO. Hussein's suppression of the PLO was fierce. Battles raged the entire length of the country, with ourselves and the Syrians vigilant but passive. Eventually, over 2,000 Palestinian guerrillas were killed and hundreds captured. The survivors moved on to Lebanon.
The PLO had failed in its armed struggle against Israel in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in Jordan. But now a new phase had already begun.
International terrorism in the air, on the ground, and even at such events as the Olympic Games in Munich. I shall never forget the terrible night of suspense when athletes of our Olympic team were captured by terrorists. The German government, with our agreement, tried to rescue the hostages. The operation tragically misfired on the way to the airport. Though the terrorists were killed, 11 of our athletes were brutally murdered as they lay bound and gagged in a helicopter. The murder of Israelis in Munich, the city associated with the rise of Hitler, cast a pall of indignant fury over Israel, over the Jewish world, indeed over most of peace-loving humanity. Closer to home, Moshe Dayan set the tone for Israeli thinking. He was Minister of Defense and virtual ruler over 1 million Palestinians in the occupied territories. Dayan no longer talked of a need to give up a lot of territory for a final settlement with Egypt and Jordan. He now believed wrongly that the situation had stabilized and that there would be neither imminent war nor early peace. In reality, the hope of a quick peace after the Six-Day War had faded. Israelis, for the most part, were apathetic. All they wanted to do was to go on with their lives. They had lulled themselves into a sense of total security. Oh, it's okay, most of them said. Everything will be all right.
Sadat faced a dilemma. How to make peace without going to war? Because going to war, if he failed, would have made his head. He tried to accept intermediate steps. He suggested a number of them. Golda did not respond to him positively. Then he started secret meetings between Egyptian representative and Mr. Kissinger, who was National Security Council in the White House at that time. During these talks, we acquired the perception that unless the Egyptians change the situation on the ground, the United States will not be willing to intervene diplomatically to change it through diplomatic means. So we realized that we have to change the geographical deployment of our lines, of military lines, before indulging into a grand peace campaign.
I understood the reasons for that decision. Having exhausted all his remedies, Sadat realized that he could not get back possession of Sinai without making war. In March 1973, Sadat sent an envoy to Damascus to propose a joint military action against Israel. The Syrian president, Hafez al-Assad, welcomed the idea, and Syrian and Egyptian high commands began coordinating plans. The precise timetable was known only to very few, and a disinformation campaign totally misled Israeli intelligence, leading them to believe that war was not on Sadat's agenda. Psychologically, this was something that many of our politicians and generals wanted to believe. Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Defense, had boldly declared that the present situation is one of virtual peace. There will not be any serious war, he said. The prevailing military doctrine was that the Arabs had little capacity for military action. Our frontier command posts at the Bar-Lev line were seen as impregnable. In this atmosphere of euphoric self-confidence, the military echelon ignored all signs of mounting tension at the canal. The army had already gone through 2 costly mobilizations. When reports started coming in about Egyptian troop buildups, this was seen as just another false alarm. The United States as well was unsure how to interpret the troop movements.
It was the unanimous opinion of American and Israeli intelligence that those were maneuvers. On October 5th, I had a long discussion with Foreign Minister Eban, and there was no hint of any imminence of war, either from his side or from our side.
Although the build-up along the canal and in the north continued day and night, the official intelligence judgment stated the probability of war is low.
It was certainly a surprise to me that when our intelligence was unable to pick it up, but it was an enormous surprise that the Israeli intelligence didn't pick it up, because I considered Israeli intelligence to be the best in the world, which is an indication of why we were not prepared and why the Israelis, I think, were not prepared for the assault that was made.
On October the 5th, the eve of Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year in the Jewish calendar, Golda Meir assembled an emergency gathering of advisors to discuss the concentration of massive Egyptian and Syrian forces. The army was placed on a low alert. In the ensuing hours, the situation became critical. Our intelligence now knew, too late, that a massive Egyptian attack was planned for 6 p.m. the next day. But as Israelis gathered for the commencement of prayers, few realized that the impossible had happened, Israeli intelligence had failed, and on the morrow, Israel would be fighting for its life for the 4th time in its history.